All right, hi everyone. We are back with our next section of the workshop. I'm very happy to introduce the big boss himself, Mr. Vishal Sidhu, who will be talking about whether losing a war can change a nation.
Hi everyone, Vishal here. So one of the most interesting things whenever you're taking a look at a textbook or any specific history book, it always talks about an effect of a war. It always talks about how the victors of each specific war are being treated or what the results are. And as we know, history is oftentimes written by the winners, but what exactly happens to a country when it loses a war or when it is decapitated entirely? So with this specific presentation, we're going to be taking a look at Japan during the war itself, and also a little bit of an understanding about how Japan has changed over time. The first most important thing that we want to go to understand is what exactly happened prior to the Second World War and during the Second World War itself with Japan and a couple of its neighbors. And we want to also be able to understand how the war essentially made a big difference to Japan, and is it just a war that changed it as a nation? The first thing we want to be able to do is we want to be able to go down memory walling. In this sense, we want to go take a look at China and understand what exactly happened and why it happened. One example that we can take a look at here is the rape of Nanjing. You essentially saw an upwards of 20,000 individuals raped, 300,000 dead, and you also had a lot of different war crimes that were committed by the Japanese army at this particular time. Why did they do this in the first place? What exactly drove them in this specific pursuit? The simplest way to be able to understand this is to be able to understand the psyche that they were in, and that you were in a position where you wanted to be able to conquer the entire world, and you had to be able to reach this by any means possible. And in the same way, they considered this as a genocide, that the war had already been in a position where you wanted to be able to come out as a victor. And in this sense, you had a lot of different types of methods that were used to be able to torture people to be able to get that subordination in place. And if you take a look at a lot of the extrajudicial killings of the Chinese prisoners of war as well, you were able to see in the Yangtze River, 60,000 people that essentially were killed after winning the war on the 18th of December 1937, that were machine gunned. At the Taiping Gate, we had over 1,500 Chinese soldiers who were blown up by landmines, or they were either burnt by petrol and fire or killed by bayonets. So all of this paints an extremely gruesome picture of what this specific time in history looked like and what the Japanese army or regime were capable of doing. And this boils down to the same question that we keep on asking again and again. Why were they like this? What they did and why they most likely did it the way they did it. Now, to be able to understand this completely, it's not going to be something that can be encapsulated in a simple presentation. Of course, there are a lot of different understandings that need to be there in place, but very specifically, if you were to be able to understand it from the structure that was being set, you were in a military dictatorship or a Tokugawa shogunate, which essentially meant that each person that was part of the army was strictly following the order that was being set. And in this sense, you had Bushido in place. So you had strict allegiance to not just the army, but to the emperor itself. And people were willing to be able to even kill themselves to be able to show this sense of respect or this sense of belonging that they had towards the military. And until the military restoration, this was something that was in place for a pretty long time. Second of all, once the Meiji Restoration took place, you also had an understanding that Japan was very far behind. Now, if you were to take a look at the Japanese economy until this point, they always had an understanding that Japan was miles ahead from a lot of the other competitors that were all over the world. It was miles ahead of Japan. And you also saw some inklings that pointed towards this internally, but because they were closed up, it became quite challenging for them to have the comparisons take place on a yearly basis, for example. And in this sense, the moment you realize that you're super far behind than where you're expected to be, you have an entire marathon that you need to go to run. And I guess this added pressure as well to a lot of the people that were part of the army. And in this sense, you also realize that there was a tendency for a lot of the individuals in the army to have some form of ethnic supremacy towards other nations, or be a little bit more belligerent towards other countries. And this was seen obviously by the defeat of China as well as Russia. And the fourth most important thing in this sense is that you already had severe xenophobia amongst its people, where a lot of the Japanese people at this particular point thought that they were significantly higher than the other individuals that ruled the world. And you realize that this dynamic is what resulted in a lot of the belligerent actions that were taking place in this sense. And most of the examples that you see here, for example, with this quote from a famous philosopher as well, that Japan would strive to fulfill a predestined role of being the champion of Asia. Now, what's more important essentially is, was it just the war that caused all of this and created all of those chain reactions to be able to change Japan entirely and flip it 180 degrees? Or was it something completely different? Is it just losing a specific war? And to be able to understand this, there are two smaller questions that we need to be able to understand first. First of all, does victory in Japan Day change Japan entirely? Or does something happen after that? Now, to be able to take a look at the progress or the changes that you started seeing in Japan during this particular period, you saw a significant amount of adaptation of American culture, or adoption of the third culture in this sense, from a lot of the American influence that was present in Japan during this period. So you had things like American baseball that got adopted quite a bit. You had a lot more pageantry, you had a lot more televisions that were in place during this period, and it also followed quite a bit of peace. But if you take a look at it from a relatively big picture, losing the war itself had reality checks that the Japanese regime had to take onto itself, as well as the people itself. So in this sense, the moment you lose, it comes as a realization that the core belief that you might have had, that you were a superior race, that you are undefeatable, it's something that is no longer there. And it also means that the influence that you've had in the past was false. And in this instance, when you also have to be in a position where there are other countries that are significantly better than you and have been able to push you down, there is that reality check that sets in place by itself. The second most important thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand or discuss in this sense is Douglas MacArthur. So right after the Second World War, Douglas MacArthur gets stationed to Japan, and in terms of the surrender that you had the Japanese army take on or give in to at that point to the Allied forces, you had a lot of changes that kept on being made. First of all, the most important one is the constitutional amendment that takes place, where you had Japan's government essentially no longer able to control what was going to be set in stone in law. And you had 100 over constitutional amendments that were being made, and it still lasted until today. So to be able to make sure that this seems relatively fair as well, you had polls conducted before and after the constitution was being amended, and you were able to see a difference in terms of how that entire amendment was being made in the first place. Now, if you take a look at the Japanese diet by itself, it was relatively closed up. It was following a monarchy type system in the past. And with a lot of the changes that took place here, you started seeing more freedoms that were being granted to the Japanese people. But at the same time, you also had a loss of an ownership of an army. Japan was no longer able to have a standing army in place, as well as be able to carry out any form of action of war for a very long time. And until today, while this has been reversed quite a bit, it's still something that is etched in everyone's, I guess, memory, or also in their personalities as well, with regards to how you want to be able to move towards a pacifist system in this sense. And if you take a look at the constitution, it basically falls into three different perspectives, where you want to be able to have complete demilitarization, you want to be able to have some level of dependence with the United States of America, and you're even able to see this with a lot of the army bases that are being that are still present until today. And the third most important thing is that you're able to give more power to the people. So you avoid going into a situation again where an entire army is able to be commanded by one single person, and you might be able to have another World War occur. Fourth, and the most important one thing is, and this is quite similar to a lot of the other countries that are in the world, you simply had globalization, where the entire world is changing. So the main reason right now why you're able to have ice cream while watching this workshop at home on your Apple laptop, or which was made in China, your ice cream is probably containing some macadamia nuts that are from Middle Africa. You've been sitting on a nice Italian chair. And all of this essentially means that you're able to get diversity in terms of experience, but at the same time, you're also sharing economic power. You're able to have a lot more peaceful negotiations take place, and you're able to improve the standard of life that you have. But of course, this comes at a cost, just like everything else. And in this same sense, while you progress a lot more, it also means that you lose some form of autonomy, because you sort of amalgamate with the rest of the world in terms of culture and what you're going to be able to create as well. So that's basically about it for this extremely short lecture. I just want to keep it brief so everyone would still have a lot of energy left. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot it in the comment section or any other platforms, and we can discuss further then. Thank you.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah, sure.
So like the implication with Japan not having a standing army now, although like I think for all intents and purposes they more or less do have one. Do you feel that this is something that would, like there's a lot of talk about revoking that constitutional clause? So do you feel that that's something that Japan should go for in terms of militarization, or should it?
Well, to be able to answer that question, five different perspectives. One, if you take a look at it geopolitically, answer would be yes, because it does have quite a lot of strong opponents in the area. It's surrounded by China, so it's a pretty big reason to be able to have your own standing army. And you also be having conflicts with South Korea that could, be a little bit softer if you had a bigger army to go fight. Second, I think you also need to take a look at the military bases that are in Japan. And this basically means that if anything goes wrong, you do get support, so it might not be the necessary. Third, again, for a reason to not have a standing army or to have a very strong one, is that Japan still is in a very dire economic situation where it's barely able to escape from its severe inflation that it's been having over the past 2 decades. While it's seeming to be a little bit positive in the last quarter, it is still an issue. So if you're to have an army, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And most countries spend up to about 10% of their GDP on a standing army, or at least about 5%. And that would be a very big impact on the economy for Japan itself. And I think fifth, and the most important one in this sense, or the one that is a bit weirder as well, is just the identity that you have as a country by itself, and the necessity for you to be able to protect yourself in case anything goes wrong. And I think that's something that's quite crucial. And would that be worth 10% of your economy when you're still struggling quite a bit to be able to achieve positive growth? That's up for discussion.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Vishal, for taking the time to run this workshop. We'll end the stream here.